But we will first start with Professor Nikos Ntoumanis' keynote. He will talk about antecedents of need-supportive and need-thwarting interpersonal styles. And many of us are triggered by exact the same question when we search for effective ways to train health professionals, teachers, or coaches in adopting more motivating styles. Insights on its antecedents are essential. As you may be guessed from Nikos' name, he has Greek roots, yet he has lived all over the world in the UK, Australia, and now in Denmark, and everywhere he went, he left his legacy in terms of excellent research. So each presenter will give a talk of 25 minutes, and after each talk we will leave 5 minutes to ask questions. So let's not take much of their time anymore so that we can listen to these interesting presentations. And please join me in welcoming Professor Nikos Ntoumanis.
Good morning. I can't see my slides. Okay. Thank you for this kind introduction, Lynn. I'm very glad to be here, and thank you for finding the time to come and attend my talk. As Lynn said, I will present today a work that I've done for the last year or so. It was actually quite a significant amount of work trying to identify antecedents of need-supportive and need-thwarting interpersonal styles. And I will present the results of a systematic review and a meta-analysis on the topic. How do I move forward? Yeah, it doesn't. Okay, so the purpose of my talk is to present the results of the review, and also to present to you a classification system that was developed as an outcome of this review that classifies antecedents of interpersonal styles across different life domains. And we proposed this classification system because when we reviewed the literature, we found out there wasn't any guiding framework, and we hope this framework will guide future research in the field. I will also present the results of a meta-analysis and associated statistics which show the effect sizes between different antecedents and need-supportive and need-thwarting behaviors. And then at the end, I will offer some insights and recommendations for future research in the field. So you all know this process model of change that many of us, if not all, have tested. And it always starts with the communication style. And there's so much work these days, and there are lots of meta-analyses in different life domains, and more recently a meta-review of all the meta-analyses, essentially showing what happens after people are exposed to need-supportive and need-thwarting styles. But the point I want to make today is that there is one significant gap in our evidence. We don't know how these styles develop. These styles do not develop in a vacuum. What makes a parent, a teacher, a sports coach, a work supervisor need-supportive or need-thwarting? So that's the aim of the review, to identify and classify all these antecedents. And at the end of my talk, I'll present some points to explain why I think this line of work is important. I'll start by presenting some of the past work that's been done in this field, and I've selected 2 or 3 key papers. The first one is an early work by Luc Pelletier, who did some work in schools and identify 3 types of antecedents, which he called pressure from above, pressure from within, and pressure from below. So pressure from above is the influence of supervisors, time pressures that might limit the extent to which someone might be autonomy supportive. Pressure from below is perceptions of others' motivations. So for instance, if you think as a teacher that your students lack self-determined motivation, you as a teacher would be less likely to be autonomy supportive. And pressure from within is your own self-determined motivation. So if you lack self-determined motivation, then you're less likely to be autonomy supportive when interacting with others. We took this work in the context of physical education, and we identify a number of other antecedents at the contextual level, such as opportunities for professional development, job security, work-life conflict, and we saw how these predict teachers' need satisfaction and need frustration and psychological well-being and ill-being, and how all these predicted autonomy supportive and controlling teaching. John Marshall-Reeve has done work around the same concepts, and he has identified some additional antecedents such as cultural factors and beliefs and personality factors. But when we reviewed this area, we found out that there isn't really an overall guiding framework. So a few years ago, with a former PhD student of mine, Doris Matusic, we proposed a classification system, and I can't really figure out, here it is, essentially with 3 dimensions: contextual factors, which we broke down into 2 specific ones, but essentially it was contextual antecedents, perceptions of others' behaviors and motivation, and personal factors. And we identified specific antecedents that fit under these 3 categories. And this was based on a narrative review of literature across different life domains. What I'm going to present today is an elaboration of this model where we added another level of hierarchy just because the evidence since 2016 has grown quite substantially. And I think the revised model is actually more parsimonious. So I will present the results of the meta-analysis. And I'll start with the inclusion criteria. So we included all quantitative studies that have measured what they call an antecedent of any need-supportive or thwarting style. And we included participants who self-reported that they used the style, or they perceived a significant other using the style. So a teacher self-reporting on their style, for example, or a student reporting on their teachers. We didn't have any eligibility criteria that would restrict certain demographic groups or certain life domains. So we tried to be as inclusive as possible. We excluded studies that did not explicitly cite SDT as the guiding framework, and we excluded studies or variables within the studies that were not explicitly identified by the authors as antecedents of the styles. And of course, we excluded studies for which we cannot obtain the relevant information. So this is the Prisma flow chart. And as you can see, we identified a fair few studies, of which we were able to include in our review 90. So I essentially, actually, I don't know if I could go back. Yes, just to give you a brief overview, the vast majority of the studies came from the fields of parenting, education, and sports/exercise. There were very few studies in the health domain or in the work domain. All 90 studies had a self-report of the style used by significant others. In some of the studies, there were also one's own reports of the style they were using. And in a very few studies, there were observer reports, independent reports of the style. So we had to take some decisions to make this exercise more efficacious. One of the problems that we have, I think, in the SDT literature, and that's not really related just to my talk, is the proliferation of similar terms that mean the same thing, very similar conceptual underlining, but we use different terms, which I think is something that the SDT community should seriously think about. But anyhow, we had to take some decisions in terms of how we're going to group variables. So, for instance, and all studies are made to measure structure. We classify them as competence support, interpersonal involvement as relatedness support, etc. So we ended up essentially looking at 6 styles, both the overall need support and need thwarting, but also need specific need support and need thwarting. So actually not 6, 8. 8 different combinations. So this is the framework that we are proposing, and I'm going to go through it in more detail. So these are not the only antecedents we found. These are what I call general factors. And these general factors emerge from combining very specific antecedents. We identify quite a few antecedents, probably specific ones, probably 60 or 70. So we grouped the specific ones into general ones where it was possible. And I'm going to show you how we did the grouping in a minute. I will present each of these dimensions now in turn, starting with the social contextual factors. The 2 general factors we identified were external pressures and social connection and support. So there were 2 specific factors that underpin the general factor and 1 specific factor for social connection and support. So what we did is for specific factors that were too unique to be combined with other specific factors, we carried them through as general factors if there was a substantial number of studies. And these 3 are examples of very specific factors, very rare, only be measured in 1 study each, that we couldn't really combine into a general factor. So moving to the next dimension, perceptions of others. They were, broadly speaking, positive and negative perceptions. So these are some examples of positive perceptions, how I perceive others to be motivated, how much effort they put, their emotional state, both positive and negative. The 3rd factor, the 3rd dimension, the personal one, was by far the most frequently examined. There were over 40 specific antecedents identified in this review, which we classified in these general factors. So one general factor was adaptive motivation, and some of the motivational variables here were from SDT, but there were also some variables that came from different theories of motivation. We had also maladaptive motivation measured in 44 studies, again SDT variables, and also other motivational variables not related to SDT. We had style-related beliefs, how effective significant others felt the style was, how widespread within the social context this style was. And so that was a separate factor. We also had factors, beliefs that were not related to style. There were quite diverse beliefs, for instance, regarding knowledge and learning, regarding the nature of motivation. And these were both positive and negative. Internal pressures, the pressures from within, was another factor that we identified in the review. Some other specific general factors were positive and or negative social and emotional functioning, such as well-being, emotional intelligence, or ill-being, and also some negative personality factors. And these are the very specific personal factors that were too rare and too unique to be combined. We also looked at demographics, but I don't have time to go through the results for those. So that was the systematic review parts. Then we did the meta-analysis. We didn't use the outdated Cohen's criteria. We used more recent evidence based on empirical work in psychology. So these are the benchmarks we used to classify effect sizes as small, medium, or large. We carry out the analysis using multi-level meta-analysis. We tested a number of moderators. Surprisingly, we didn't find any moderation effects. but we discussed some possible reasons in the paper. Essentially, I think it mainly has to do with power, lack of power to detect effects. Now, I could have presented 4 combinations of results because, as you can imagine, we had the general antecedents, and we also have the very specific antecedents. And we have general styles, as in overall need support or overall need thwarting, but we also have the specific styles, so need support, need specific support and need specific thwarting. In the paper, which I'll put on the Open Science Framework next week, we present the results for these 3 combinations. We don't present the last one just because the possible number of effect sizes was around 360. So in my presentation today, I'll focus on the first combination, general antecedent factors predicting general interpersonal styles. So these are the effect sizes. As you can see, some of them had quite broad confidence interval, and that's because those with a very wide confidence interval were based on a fairly small number of studies. Whereas those with bigger confidence intervals smaller confidence intervals had a bigger number of studies. So when you look actually at the different significant predictors, those here on the right of need support, in combination when you look at need-specific support, autonomy, competence, and relatedness. And I don't have all the slides here I didn't want to bombard you too much information, but the most consistent predictor, the answer to the question, what makes someone need supportive, the most consistent predictor of overall need support and need-specific support across all 3 needs with effect sizes that were medium was adaptive motivation, and specifically one's own psychological need satisfaction and autonomous motivation. So for instance, a teacher who reported that they had high psychological need satisfaction and they were self-determined in their job were fairly likely to be need supportive. So of course there were other significant predictors, but adaptive motivation, as I said, was the most consistent across all combinations. The answer to the question, what makes someone need thwarting, again, we identified a number of significant predictors, and the most consistent one across overall need thwarting and need-specific thwarting with a medium effect size was maladaptive motivation. And specifically, when you look at the specific antecedents, were 2, amotivation and need frustration. So for both need support and need thwarting, the most consistent antecedent was adaptive and maladaptive motivation factors. So both belong in the 3rd category I showed you earlier, the personal factors. So these are the power enhanced funnel plots, and for those of you who are not familiar, they're used to show where there's any publication bias. There doesn't seem to be any publication bias here because there isn't really any pattern of association between power and the direction of the effect. They're symmetrical. So there doesn't seem to be any evidence of publication bias, but what we see is quite a few underpowered studies, which is even more the problem when you look at need thwarting. In terms of lack of power. But again, there doesn't seem to be any publication bias. The publication bias would have been evident if higher effect sizes were found for studies with low power, which doesn't seem to be the case. So we looked at study quality. Of course, each study was coded against criteria for the specific design. Most of the studies we had in the meta-analysis were correlational in nature. And so we used this tool that can be used to assess both correlational and experimental studies. 90% of the studies met at least 3 of the 5 criteria. For quality, there were 2 criteria that were not met by a lot of studies. So if you're doing any work in this area, bear in mind these two criteria when you report the results of your studies. I think I've run out of time, so I'll go straight to the discussion. So some key findings is that the quality of the included studies was acceptable and did not moderate the obtained effect sizes. There was no obvious evidence for publication bias, but there was a concern in terms of lack of adequate power. There were no effects from moderators and demographic variables, but such effects should not be ruled out. And I think a better way of testing particularly the effects of demographic variables is by conducting individual participant meta-analysis, but this will require each study to provide their own data sets. It is also very important to clarify here that what was labeled as antecedent was what the authors of the study mentioned as these variables being antecedent. A lot of these variables were not experimentally manipulated, so they were conceptual antecedents, but there was no evidence for manipulation. One problem in the SDT literature is that we do a lot of interventions, but we don't actually measure before and after the intervention the antecedents we're trying to manipulate. So if, for example, if you work in a school and you think that it's teachers' motivation that's the problem in terms of being need supportive, we don't measure how much our training changes teacher motivation from before to after. So without this information, the studies could not be included in this meta-analysis. I think we only had about a couple of RCTs and some course experimental studies, but not that many. Very few studies, as I say, was in the health domain and in the workplace, which is very surprising for me. I think it's useful to know what, for example, makes a job supervisor need supportive or need thwarting. It's a need to move between self-reports and include independent observation for interpersonal styles. And we need some longitudinal studies to examine how antecedent variables can predict styles and be predicted by such styles in the future. For instance, teacher motivation could predict how need supportive they are. The more need supportive they are, the more motivated the students will be. And the more motivated the students will be, this will be perceived by the teachers, and that will make them actually feel even more self-determined in their job. So that would be a closed feedback loop. I would also like to make the case for expanding this work in the future and measuring antecedents of a third style that in the last few years I have been working with, and that was the topic of my previous SDT keynote 3 years ago on needed different styles. Some takeaway messages, because the time is running out. The literature is too diverse. There is no overall conceptual framework. Authors pick and choose variables as they see fit. I think we need a conceptual framework that will try to classify the different antecedents. So we propose in this paper this framework that identifies the breadth of the different antecedents and provides evidence regarding their effect sizes. Some effect sizes obviously are more reliable than others because they're based on bigger rather than smaller number of studies. So this is my last slide. It is important to understand the various antecedents of styles because this can influence the degree to which people are willing to adopt or willing to show up for the need supportive communication training. These antecedents could be actually moderators because they can influence the degree to which they adhere to the intervention protocol. So fidelity to the intervention is crucial for intervention effectiveness. So these antecedents could actually affect the degree of intervention fidelity. And when feasible, they can be intervention targets in themselves. Before we try to change students' motivation, let's work with teachers first. Or could be actually signal points to tailor intervention so that when we go in the workplace and we want to change how supervisors work, we need to be mindful of the external constraints they have coming from above or from other directions. I would like to thank the research team that was behind this work. All the data for this is an open science framework, and the preprint will be available next week. And thank you for your attention. 5 minutes for questions. Okay. So who is moderating the questions? Lynn? Are you gonna? Okay.
Hi, Nikos. Thanks for the nice presentation. I'm just wondering whether you consider leadership style as one of the possible antecedents in your analysis?
Leadership styles?
Yeah.
If that information was provided in the studies, yes, we have. We had about 60 or 70 specific antecedents, so I can't remember all of them, but I think leadership styles was probably one of them, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
So you conclude with a call for a more systematic approach to kind of like making these measures related, that would be related to like different form of need support. So in that sense, what would be your suggestions for the next time that you would like to do meta-analysis? Like what would you like to see being done systematically in connection with measuring
that the
supportive styles?
If I can show you the framework again, that the authors do a better job justifying which antecedents they used. Because at the moment there doesn't seem to be any justification of, maybe sometimes they will refer to a specific study that was carried out a few years ago, but there has to be some more systematic way of choosing and testing these antecedents. And for some antecedents there is less evidence than others. And definitely for some domains, there is very little evidence.
But would you have suggestions of something that you would like to see systematically, like from your own experience of what you've seen in those reviews?
I'm not sure what you mean by systematically. I think the selection of the antecedents should be done in a more systematic way and not in a random way. The methodology, I made suggestions in terms of what methodologies we're lacking, more experimental studies, changing the antecedents before we're trying to change the recipients of the styles' behaviors. Right? Some of these studies are missing. And yeah, I don't know if I answer your question, but these are some of the...
Well, give me a bit of an idea, so thanks for that.
Thank you.